Thanks everyone for coming to this Ed Talk. And is the mic working now or not yet? Yeah. It is, great. So my name is John Schnurr, and I co-founded and I lead a nonprofit called America Achieves, and I've been involved in education for the last 20 plus years. Really psyched to be at this conference, and psyched to be with those of you in this room who clearly want to go a bit more in depth on education, and I'm sure many of you have more expertise than I do in so many aspects of education, but hopefully I will be helpful today in giving you a little talk about America Achieves, our nonprofit, and more broadly, my sense of the context of where we are in education, that if I were in some of your shoes, things about the landscape that I would be taking into consideration as I was doing my work. I said at the end of yesterday's 6 p.m. panel discussion, when the moderator asked each of us to make predictions, mind-blowing predictions for what happens next. My prediction is that in 20 years, the U.S. is back to number one in the world in education, in terms of excellence and equity. As you know, 30 years ago, we were number one in the world in education on such measures as the percentage of our young people with post-secondary degrees, percentage of our young people with high school degrees. We've slipped to the middle of the pack among industrialized countries, to 14th in percentage of our young people with college degrees, 22nd in percentage of our young people with high school degrees. And so my prediction is in 20 years, we'll be back to number one in the world, both in excellence and overall performance, but also equity in terms of gap closing. And my question to all the people like yourselves who are leading in education and education technology is, for you, how are you going to help make that happen? And for us as a nonprofit, how are we going to make that happen so that collectively we can pull this off? And that's my sort of passion and interest, is this is a collective effort, but how do we all make that major, game-changing, history-changing goal happen? In that context, what I'd love to do is, before I just share stuff, I want to be sure what I'm sharing is grounded in what you want. So what I'd love to do to start this off is for you to think to yourself for a moment about what one question. I lead a nonprofit, I worked for President Obama, I worked in the Clinton administration, I sort of know a bit about education nationally. I don't know education technology in depth the way that many of you do. Think about a question that you'd like to hear from me in my comments that will help you address something that's important to you. And what I'd like to do before I start, I'd like to have people raise hands, quickly go around, just if you'd say your name and organization, and one question that you'd like me to address in my comments. And then I'll just take 2 or 3 minutes to organize my comments around your questions. Maybe ask you to have a quick conversation with somebody at your table, and then I'll share some comments before we close. So with that, would love for anybody who'd like to. I'm not going to answer your questions up front, but I'm going to weave my comments around a set of your questions. Who would like to raise your hand and ask a question you'd like me to address? Yes.
Enrique Olivares, and I work for American Public Media, which is the second largest public radio producer in the country. So I guess my question for you, it may be a little off topic, but not, is what do you think is not being talked about in the media regarding education?
Great.
And where we are?
Great. I'm thrilled to address that question. I will restrain myself until I weave it into my comments, so thank you for that question. Who else has got a question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathy Gibson. I'm an educator from Valparaiso University, do a lot in graduate education in particular. I'm wondering if you can speak to the role of adjunct instructors in the future and tenure.
Adjunct and tenure. In K-12 or post-secondary? Post-secondary, you mean? Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Who else? Yes.
I'm Chris Sleet, CEO of Quist. The role of informal education or after-school educational activities to supplement in-classroom activities.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes.
Loch Langdon Mayo Clinic. How do you see learner types affecting future types of education? Focus primarily for me would be higher education and professional learning.
Affecting learner types, I missed a key word before higher education.
How you present education to the learners.
Got it. Okay, great. Great. These are great questions. Yes.
Marcos Lewis, Unicon. One of the panel questions yesterday was getting to scale and taking some of the innovation that's proven at smaller scales in the 5, 10, 50 district size and extrapolating that. What's the role of nonprofits and others in kind of helping solve those or explore those scale challenges?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Maybe a couple more, because otherwise I can have less and less prospect of answering these questions well. These are great. Yes.
Trish McCarty, Starshine Academy International Schools, K-12. You said that we were going to be #1 in 20 years, and I would like to know if you think that we're still going to only be #1 compared to our dropout rates and our college graduation rates, or will there be some other criteria that makes us #1?
Great. Great question. All right. Yeah, maybe last two. One here and then one in the back.
Hey, John. Jeff Snipes from the Education Superhighway and Challenge Success in San Francisco. Question for you would be, what do you think we should be teaching that we're not?
Great. Great question. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mike Spizzioli from Wilkes University in Pennsylvania, and I too do a lot in graduate education and especially in the online environment. I'm wondering if there's anything that the federal government is contemplating in helping schools to be able to mitigate the Title IV regulations and state-by-state authorization, which has just bogged everyone down.
Great. I don't actually know enough about Title IV regs to comment on that specifically, but I will give it a shot more generally. Okay, those are great questions. I feel like I should now turn to you for answers because you guys have such expertise, but since I said I would try to answer them, I will. What I would like to do is take 2 or 3 minutes, probably 3, to organize my thoughts around this. So I'd like you to talk to somebody at your table if you're there, or if not, maybe you can move a little bit. And I'd like you to take one of these questions that you're interested in, that you've got a particular insight on, to share, and share them. And I might, at some point in the next 20 minutes, if I've got time, ask you to share out any particular interesting insights. So if you think about the questions around what's not being spoken about in the media that should be, the role of adjuncts in tenure and post-secondary, the role of informal education and after-school support, learner types, how they affect how you present learning, how do you scale innovation, the role of nonprofit and others, by what criteria should we measure whether we're back to #1 in the world in education, what should we be teaching that we're not, and if anybody has answers on Title IV, I would especially like those, since I don't know Title IV very well. That would be great. But if you think about one of those questions, if you pair up with somebody, spend a few minutes talking about it, and then I'll come back and talk to you in a bit. And again, if you're not at a table, then maybe just move over to a nearby table and introduce yourselves. Okay, 1 minute warning. Culture. Culture. Okay. I hate to interrupt because these look like actually really good conversations, but maybe trade cards and keep your notes. And what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to, if you'd keep in mind, if there's a particularly significant insight that you shared or heard that you'd like to come back to at the end, I think at this point I'm going to take 10, 12, 14 minutes or so to share some of my comments around your questions. And then at the end, open it up for any last questions to me, or if there's a really compelling insight that one of you had or heard, I'd love for you to share that before we close in 18 minutes and 18 seconds, as I'm reminded by our generous host's clock. Okay, so let me start with the context, the number one by what criteria and why. Let me give you a little context. I said a bit, but I want to say more about where we are in education. And some of you know this, but I think it's worth keeping in mind the context, both in terms of not only the moral imperative and the economic competitiveness imperative, but I think some drivers that will be affecting all of our work. So the, we, in some ways, a lot of our economic successes today were spurred in part by our successes over time throughout our history in improving education, creating public schools in the first place in the early 20th century, getting many, many more kids through high school. We essentially, for each economic age we had, we actually pretty successfully, if very inequitably, adapted our educational system to the needs of the economic age. It helped drive success in the 1800s in our agrarian economy and the industrial economy. And now, as many of you know very well, we've been in the process of making an enormous economic shift to an economic era which is driven by globalization and by technology and by change and adaptation. Often the skills that you know well are required for today's jobs and today's industries are dramatically different and higher and need many, many more people to achieve those than ever before. And I think the thing that makes me optimistic, actually, about why I think we can get to number one in the world in education in the next 20 years, and I'll tell you about the measures in a second, is that not only from my perspective as somebody who's deeply passionate as an educational leader, as a moral imperative for our kids and as an opportunity to make a fair society and for citizenship, but I think we actually are seeing around the country this marriage of those focusing on social justice and human potential with our economic interests in the country, because I think there's recognition among the enlightened leaders in our economy that we actually can't succeed without an adaptation of our educational system. And I think when you combine forces of those fighting for kids and social justice with those fighting for economic success, you actually often see dramatic things happen, which I think we're in. Sometimes it feels like slow motion as it's happening, but it's actually happening very rapidly. We're going through changes that the powerful interests in the country align in terms of a way that meets our kids' needs, meets our economic needs, that I think really gives me a lot of hope. One data point that shows you the change we've gone through just in the last 30 years. In 1973, 1 in 4 US jobs required some kind of post-secondary education, 1 in 4. Today, nearly 2 in 3 US jobs require some kind of post-secondary education. Essentially, we've gone from a ticket to a middle-class job being a high school degree to a ticket to a middle-class job being a post-secondary degree of some kind, whether a 4-year degree or 2-year degree. Even if you look at the manufacturing sector, most manufacturing jobs today require some kind of post-secondary degree. This is no longer kind of the blue-collar, low-skilled jobs of the past that both fueled our economic competitiveness, but also our ability for middle class to be able to get this jobs and what they needed to, foster a middle-class lifestyle in this country and a really successful democracy and capitalism. So that's a sense of the changing bar in terms of what jobs are required. Now, we also have changes in terms of just citizenship. We have a very complicated information-based society where every day all of us are having to make decisions based on much more information than we ever had before. So our ability to be good citizens in the way that Thomas Jefferson way back thought depended on a good education. By the way, his biggest frustration, second biggest frustration as a leader when he died, was that he had failed in the state of Virginia to get a system of universal public education established in the state of Virginia for at least the first few years, because he realized that was so critical to citizenship. So while employment is a driver, as we look at citizenship in an information age society, we also need people who can navigate and assemble much more complicated information, figure out what makes sense, and use that to drive their own lives forward. So we've got this massive need for our society. The question is, by what criteria do we need to be number one, and can we measure ourselves? I think that I'd say the leading ones are number one in the world in the number and percentage of young people who get a post-secondary degree, the percentage of young people who get a high school degree, and then along the way, percentage of young people young kids who are ready for success in kindergarten. By third or fourth grade, number one in the world in the percentage of our kids who can read by third or fourth grade, not only read to read, but read to learn at the level that they're going to need in order to be able to fuel their success over time. And we're going to need to be number one in the world by eighth grade and in early high school in having the foundations for math and science and technology, and having the skills and the analytic ability to kind of think in that way, in a way that can help people apply other skills to jobs of math, science, and technology, which will infuse so much. So I think we got 5 or 6 indicators, and then on each of those, we can't just think about what our overall rates are. We have to think, given the fact we've got a very diverse society, which is our great strength, and we've got the majority of kids now in our schools are kids of color. Rising numbers are low income. We can't be a fair society or a stable society or an economically competitive society if we don't look at how we help our underserved kids achieve much better too, including with some very high potential kids from very low income situations who are not being recognized and tapped today, who can be our great scientists, technology leaders, elected leaders, but if we don't do a better job of improving the entire system with a focus on both excellence and gap closing, we'll never help all the kids succeed and advance, nor will we help find the most talented kids from across socioeconomic strata to do all the jobs that we need in order to compete as a country. So those are some indicators in terms of how I think we ought to be number one. The good news is that we do have pockets of success today that actually are showing the way for what's possible. We released a report last week that at the panel I talked a bit about when the moderator asked last night at America Achieves, and if you want to see the report in depth, you can go to our website at www.americaachieves.org. But we did a report with OECD, based in Paris, and we showed that actually the middle class students in this country are lagging behind their peers globally, as much as our low income peers are lagging behind theirs. That our middle class students are lagging behind 16 other countries, 24 other countries in math, 16 other countries in science, and that for those people who think, well, you know what, we're doing fine in education, it's only when a kid's poor that we're not succeeding. Turns out we've got some low-income schools that are actually doing very well, which refute the fact that poor kids can't learn at high levels. But this data also shows that this is an American issue, not just a low-income issue. If we're going to succeed, we've got to lift all boats, including very much middle-class Americans. Now in that, we also highlighted there's some individual schools. We have this project which we created with OECD, a international PISA assessment for individual schools. The PISA is the international indicator when you hear about how the US is doing in the world in math, science, reading, how our country's doing. So far, we've only known how our country's doing. And most people hear that data and think, you know what, that's somebody else's kid, somebody else's school. 80% of Americans think our schools are in crisis, but 80% of parents think that their kids' school is doing just fine. Another piece of data that gives you a window into this, 90% of 8th graders expect their kids are going to get a 4-year degree. 90% of 8th graders expect they are going to get a 4-year degree. 80% of 12th graders expect that they're going to get a 4-year degree. 90% of parents in surveys we've done expect their kids are going to get a 4-year degree. And barely 30% do. And less than 10% for low income. But even in middle class America, 2 out of 3 parents are wrong about whether their kids are going to get a 4-year degree. So people care. They expect a lot. They don't realize what this higher bar is and what it's going to take. And so we created this school PISA for schools where individual schools piloted, and now this fall any high school in the country that wants to can take this, how schools are doing. And we celebrated, including I'm going to one right after the session, I'm going to a school that actually outperformed the entire world. We had low-income schools, middle-class schools at all levels who did dramatically better than their peers in that level in the United States, and had schools that outperformed South Korea, Finland, Shanghai. So we've got pockets of success right here in this country that's showing the way in terms of what's needed. We just don't have nearly enough of them, and we haven't done what we need to take to scale. Which leads me to your question about what does it take to go to scale, including what the nonprofit role is. So look, this is an impossible question to answer for the country perfectly, or otherwise we would have solved this by now, but I'll give you my sense of what it's going to take. Other than recognizing that we've got some amazing successes already, and we just have to have that we can do it, but we've got to make some dramatic changes to take that to large scale. But a few things I'd say. Number one is we do need policy, the right policies in place. And I think that having some really codified, explicit, high expectations at all levels that actually will guide and support curricular development in schools, and essentially to take the lesson from schools that succeed, where they've got clear, high expectations for all kids, and do it for entire states or the country is key. I think the Common Core is a very important part of that, but I think there are other things coming that will help support and supplement that, not federal, but national. I think secondly, if you look at what good schools do to succeed, in the end, great teaching is key, and constantly improving teaching. So we need national work policies around improved teacher quality, including, I think we're missing a whole focus on how do you attract and retain top talent into the profession and keep it in the profession in the first place. Some of the highest performing countries in the world basically have all their teachers come from the top third of college graduates. While the measures are imperfect, and I think have to be changed, and we need an American version of that. Third thing you see individual schools that applies to the country in terms of policy is the spirit of continuous improvement. So good schools are constantly getting better and better, and this is where I think the data and technology can do an unbelievably important job of helping equip teachers, schools, kids to understand where they are and constantly improve. So then we need some policies around this: high expectations, better teaching, improved teaching, continuous improvement. We need enough resources and well allocated to make this work. Good money alone doesn't solve our problems in education. There's no correlation in the world between the highest spending countries and the highest performing countries. But we've not seen a country actually make big progress without some increase in educational funding. So you need a little bit more funding, and generally used well, much better, in order to succeed, and policies around funding are important. That's the policy piece, but I think if we just got the policy piece alone, it is absolutely clear we will not actually get to number one in the world in education. Policy is not enough. Second whole area is the capacity to pull this off. I think our policy in some ways in the country is ahead of our capacity to pull this off. So the capacity among educators, among schools, among systems, among nonprofits, among for-profits, to actually equip kids and educators to be able to achieve those higher standards within the context of good policy is crucial. And one of my greatest wishes for those of you at this conference who are doing great work that's changing the lives of kids, one, keep your eye on the prize of getting great results, but two, figure out how to scale it. Because our capacity is so thin, no matter how good the policies are, we're not going to succeed without much better capacity. And the third thing, last thing I'd say on how we get there, in this oversimplified short version of a presentation of how to get to number one in education, is our culture. I actually think we need to leverage the greatest strengths of the American culture in ways that haven't been, to suppress for much more demand for a higher bar in education, much more engagement, including a big focus which we at America Chiefs are looking at on parents. I do think while you can make big improvement without parental engagement, we are looking at what it's going to take to actually parents far more engaged and smartly engaged in very busy schedules to help advance their kids' education. And how can parents play a role in calling for more, I think is going to be a big part of a culture change. We need policy, capacity building, culture, I would say are three keys. And then the role of the nonprofit sector in that is not only directly building capacity, I think that an agile nonprofit can spot opportunities and issues like this and find ways to put a spotlight on, catalyze, bring people together around how to make progress in each of those problems in a way that sometimes is more difficult for a for-profit to do when you're focusing on pulling off one thing yourself, or government to do with its constraints. I think the nonprofit sector has a great role to play in catalyzing and spotlighting and moving things, and in policy and capacity building culture. Okay, next question. What should we be teaching, including whether or not? Wow, okay. So if you look at the skills needed today, I think we clearly have to have kids truly master academics. It's not all about academics, but it's partly about academics. So actually being able to read deeply and write effectively and really understand math and science and how to apply all those skills in novel situations to new problems. So it's not just rote learning of those, but it's actually deep understanding where you can apply to problem solve, and with the ability to critically think and figure out what information needs to be applied to what situation. We know that's needed in a job, we know that's needed as citizens. So I think rigorous academics, but then applied to different contexts is crucial. I also think we have to better teach kids how to learn, and how to support them in really developing the habits of mind and habits of learning and practice that can fuel success. If I had more time, I'd say more about that, but I don't. So I just would say that we have to do a better job of that in some very doable, specific ways. And I think that overlaps a bit with, I think there's a lot of discussion recently about character. And I think we do need to do a better job of building our kids' character. Character is not innate. It's about building character. I think there's both a performance character side and a moral character side. I think Paul Tuff's book does a good job talking about some of the performance character issues, including resilience and grit, Angela Duckworth's research. But I think if we focus on those things, while then we're making sure that kids have the ability to lead and engage with others in a way that helps people understand how to work in teams, work with others, enhance the success of others around them, both in class and out of class. And that's a tall order. I mean, to help all of our kids reach those high levels is no easy task. And one of the things I would say about education is sometimes people complain and say, hey, our schools have failed. Look, our schools are doing better than they ever have before. They're not doing well enough. But this is a tall order to help all our kids really achieve all these things and learn all these things. And it's it's a first-class challenge to have, and it's hard work, but we can achieve it. Okay, different kind of learners and how the implication for how you present. Wow. So I would say that there are some different learner types. I would say that I think, now some people are going to disagree with this. I think there is a risk of going too far down the path of looking at different learning types and actually trying to tailor learning to a kid's learning style in a way. In part because I think that all of our kids actually have to master pretty high levels of material, and sometimes the way in which that's done actually can be giving kids excuses for not doing the same high-level work that other kids are doing and need to. And in part because when you get into environments where you're doing different jobs, you need to be able to build on your strengths and recognize you got strengths, but also build your capacity to work in particular ways that sometimes don't come match with how a child happened to have been developed and been supported in their families to learn in particular ways. So I'm not saying there aren't issues about important issues to address around learning style, I think, and learning modalities, but I think we have to take care to make sure we don't do that in a way that, combined with low expectations that too many adults have for our kids, including kids that learn in different ways, make sure it doesn't actually lower achievement levels. And I think that on the technology side, I'm especially worried about this on the, sort of related issue on the literacy side. I think if we personalize and appeal to different kids' interests and styles, there's a risk that we dumb down the kind of reading expectations we got for kids that I really would be careful about. Okay, the role of informal education. I think we're going to have a blurring of formal and informal education over time. I think you guys are beginning to see that. I think it's going to take some time. But as we move more toward a kind of competency-based education, I think we're going to be able to look at the roles that schools play, that after-school play, that technology plays, all in contributing to outcomes. And I think really the key is what drives success. And so again, I'd look at when we look back in 20 years and say, now we're #1 in the world in education. What role have you all played in that? What role have we all played in that? I think we're all going to be really focused on a rigorous look at what actually drives impact for kids. I think you can have tactical strategies about going to scale where only a subset of the kids are succeeding, and I suppose there's an argument you can do that for a while. But if we're not actually, in the end, producing changed outcomes for kids that we're serving, then ultimately I don't think that technology strategy is going to be financially viable, nor is it going to be viable in terms of what our kids need. But I think that the blurring will happen, and the question is who's going to be able to produce the results to help our kids achieve these high standards. And the person asked about adjunct faculty and tenure in post-secondary and K-12, those are big issues, but I think what we are going to do in fair ways is look more and more at how well we are creating the conditions for our teachers to teach, but then having real expectations, including for tenure. I think we're going to have a much more rigorous bar for what it means to get tenure in the first place. I think there are going to be different creative approaches to how we use educators, full-time educators, part-time educators, after-school educators, technology. I think we have to really make sure we keep an eye on how to keep teaching professionalized with really high-capacity, talented people who are supported to be outstanding teachers. But I think that's going to be part of a more diverse array of supporting kids' learning. And I think the question is, how do you thread that needle? And then I would say, I guess the last question before I close is, what's not being spoken about in the media that should be? I think it's a great question. I think that I don't think it's being spoken about in the media enough about this point that, we haven't failed, we haven't succeeded, we just haven't kept pace with the changing needs of our time. And I think sometimes they get these false debates, dichotomies, oh, we failed, or no, we're doing fine. And I think that it's not very productive. I think the key to if people in the country really realize that, doing a little better, but the world's changed and we're going to be left behind as a country unless we raise this bar for all of our kids, we're not going to succeed. I also think people don't realize how much differentiation of impact and quality there is across schools and programs. I think sometimes people assume that kids with certain innate abilities just are, smart at something or not smart at something, that kids with certain backgrounds or communities with certain backgrounds are good or not. But what people don't realize, and our report showed last week, is that for the same kind of kid, same kind of school, same kind of community, dramatically different outcomes based on whether a set of practices are being adopted by the kid, the school, or community. I think if we know that, it'll actually empower us to apply our American work ethic to say, you know what, this is not just coasting if you think you got a kid or a school that's high achieving. It's not going to constrain a kid because they currently are low achieving. The question is how do we apply the effort, the feedback, the practice to have individual kids, classrooms, schools make constant improvement to get to much higher standards. So with that, I think I have now done with my comments. I may be out of time. If there's time for 1 or 2 comments or questions, it's great. And if not, then I wish you guys a great day here at the conference.